Tom, we've talked about Broadcom and the Tomahawk chips for a long time. Many people aren't aware, but the Tomahawk is basically the Intel x86 of switching. Broadcom has released a new Tomahawk data center switch platform, and it's pretty spiffy. The fifth generation boasts a throughput of 51.2 terabits per second, and the lineup can run 64 800 gigabit ports or 256 200 gigabit ports. The capacity of this switch puts it on par with the latest announcements from Nvidia, which also announced a switch of similar speed at GTC this year. The switch is aimed at cloud and hyperscale networking companies to help drive adoption of those faster port speeds. But frankly, this thing's going to be everywhere, I think. What do you think, Tom?
So I love the fact that we're already talking about, mid terabits per second, dozens of terabits. I remember when the first terabit per second throughput switch came out from Barefoot Networks with Tofino, and like I couldn't imagine how fast that could be. And so now what we're seeing is, 50-ish between Nvidia. By the way, that's the Mellanox part of Nvidia. They're not running a switch on GPUs. Although now that you mention it, that might not be a bad idea. But Broadcom, like you said, they're kind of the dealer for all companies that are doing a lot of really fast stuff. So if you're not making your own silicon, you're buying it from Broadcom. And so if you look under the hood of a lot of data center switching platforms, there's a Tomahawk sitting in there. Things that are interesting to me in the reports that came out, Broadcom and a lot of industry analysts are talking about the fact that they're trying to drive adoption of these faster port speeds, and that 200 gigabit per second port speeds are finally starting to get rolling along. But when you look at what's going on here, like you're talking about 800 gigabit per second ports. One of the challenges that Broadcom is having is the SERDES, the serialization deserialization interfaces on these systems are still 100 gigabit per second, which means if you want that port to run at 800, you actually have to get like an octo SFP, which is 8 ports that are collapsed into one. So I think that this is going to be the last revision of switching that we see from Broadcom and a lot of other manufacturers for that matter that are using the 100 gigabit SERDES. They're actually going to have to rev those to a new platform. And I think this is where we're going to start getting into some interesting problems, is because when you rev that SERDES to push more data through the individual ports, you're going to start generating a lot more heat. And so we've talked about this at Tech Field Day on a number of occasions. Andy Bechtolsheim of Arista brought up the fact that you're going to see an upper limit for what these switches are going to be capable of doing, not because of anything like Moore's Law, but because the amount of heat that they're going to generate is going to be too much for the optics to handle. And that's where things like silicon photonics are going to start coming in. So I would expect that before we hit 100 terabits per second on a switch fabric or a switch throughput like Tomahawk, I think we're going to see silicon photonics kind of take over to reduce the electrical the hungry electrical problems, but also to sink a little bit more of that heat, because otherwise we're going to turn our data centers into saunas, and I don't think that that's going to be something that anybody really wants to deal with.